As we look at India's ambitions to take international trade to $2 trillion by 2030 and a 10% of global trade, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this session that will explore some of the fundamental underpinnings of our trade policy and deep integration into global value chains. Our panelists for this session are Ambassador Navdeep Suri, Distinguished Fellow ORF, Dr. Arpita Mukherjee, Professor Ikriar, Dr. Harshvardhan Singh, Chairman IKD-HBAG Advisors LLP and former DDG to the WTO, Mr. Amit Yadav, Additional Secretary, Department of Commerce, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Government of India. And with this, I hand over to the session moderator, T.S. Vishwanath, past president and founding member of PAFI and principal advisor, ASG Legal. Over to you, Vishy.
Thank you, Medha. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session on setting a target of 10% of global trade for India. I know when we were discussing this topic and we were putting this up, it was a very ambitious target to put there. It is not something which, and the idea was not to just put a number there. The idea of the 10% came from the fact that our Honorable Prime Minister has been talking of India needs to be a developed country in the next 25 years. And when you fold the future and talk about India a developed country 25 years from now, the idea was to try and see, do we need to get to 10% growth? And I will be happy if any of the panelists say that it's not necessary and we can do without a 10% growth as well and get there. But I think a critical area was to think about it and say that if India has to be a developed country, it has to be very globalized. It must have a footprint across the globe. It must develop enough companies that are multinationals. It must have value chains that are across the whole globe. And we should talk about creating not just large-scale companies, but even the medium and small-sized companies actually going out, either exporting, importing, and looking at how do we get far more integrated with the world. I think in the last few, especially in the last 1 year, we have seen for the first time in an area which I think Mr. Yadav also looks at, is the WTO eventually after many years decided that it must deliver something. We can always, quibble about what was achieved good enough or not, but the fact is that it delivered. It delivered a verdict. It gave us something to talk about. It gave us something to move forward. And India, having been a very integral part of the WTO process, I think we played our part in also ensuring that that happens. So from a multilateral trade agreement perspective, I think there is now some movement and there is more hope, if nothing else, from what the WTO delivered. When we look at what we have done across the different FTAs, we have also looked at countries which were not just small countries around or just neighbors there. We have an early FTA, harvest with Australia. We are negotiating an FTA with UK. We're negotiating an FTA with the EU. We have, again, Canada is another country which we are looking at. So, we are talking about building bilateral relations where we are talking about reducing tariffs, where we are looking about how do we harmonize regulations across the globe, and how is it possible for us to try and have a footprint across some of those countries, and how do we build value chains across some of those countries. So, I think we are taking steps in the right direction. I think we have an absolutely fantastic panel out here, I think with different views. And I don't want to take the time away from them in terms of what needs to be said. So if I could start with you, Ambassador Puri, if you could talk to us and give us an idea from your perspective, how do we get there and what is your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Krishan. I think it's a coincidence that I served in Australia and UAE, which are the two countries with which we signed the early trade agreement and the comprehensive economic partnership agreement. To me, that tells two or three things on the positive side first. One is that we learned some lessons from our previous experience in our FTAs with ASEAN countries. We learned what not to do, but we also learned how to negotiate smarter and more strategically. And for me, it's refreshing after years in government to see that instead of operating in separate silos, the Ministry of External Affairs and Ministry of or Department of Commerce are finally singing from the same hymn sheet, and are really the fact that our first 2 trade deals are with countries with which we have a strategic partnership is an indication of that convergence that is happening between our political interests and our economic interests. And I think that's hugely important. The second is the choice of countries also is, I think, governed by that past experience that let's not try to do an FTA with a country with which we are not competitive, with which we are actually competing in certain products. Let's look at those with which we have larger complementarities. And both Australia and UAE sort of fit into that basket of countries where we have complementarities. The third to me is the fact that, particularly the UAE agreement, its comprehensive nature, that we have included trade and services, we have included a specific segment on pharmaceuticals in terms of fast-tracking our generics exports, and we are also including investment into it. And again, learning from the past, we've put in pretty tough value addition norms of 40% so that we don't get flooded through third country channels in India. Having said that, on the positive side, let me also say that when we look at other countries negotiating, and we are going to be negotiating a lot of these trade agreements, I think the weakness, the frailty of the multilateral trading system means that we are increasingly going down the bilateral route than the multilateral trading systems route. That means we need a very large cadre of trained and experienced negotiators on trade matters, including those who have very sectoral specific expertise. And I think we currently really don't have that bandwidth to negotiate 10 agreements at a go with 10 prominent economic partners. So I think it's something that we really need to think through. How are we going to build that bandwidth that enables us to get into multiple negotiations? And as we engage with the EU in particular, I think one of the challenges for us is that old adage that does trade follow investment or investment follow trade? And if it is investment that is crucial to our trade agreements, then surely we need to sort out the mess that we are in on BPAs. And hopefully the EU negotiations will shed some light on a viable BPA, bilateral investment promotion and protection agreement that we can use with other countries. And last point, because I'm speaking at a PAFI event, I think I have to say this, that it's important that we communicate effectively our concerns and our interests, both domestically and overseas. We have very clear positions, we have valid positions, but do we communicate them effectively enough so that we are not seen as the bad guys in the trade negotiation room? I think we did pretty well at WTO, and that's something that we need to build upon.
Thank you, Ambassador Suri, for one, your points, and also for, I mean, I think it's a good benchmark you set for all the speakers that you should stay within 3 minutes. So, Arpita, may I move to you? One of the things which you talked about, Ambassador, was a band of people who could provide inputs for negotiations. I think Arpita does that on a regular basis. So, Arpita, over to you to kind of.
See, basically, there are two parts of the there are actually three players in a trade negotiation. One is actually the industry, one is the academic and legal experts, and one is the government policymakers. And these are not isolated from each other. Because what we tend to do is to actually look at from an academic angle. When you are looking into how do you provide a feedback in a country like India, we face a little bit of hurdle as academics because we don't have data. So access to data and information. So we don't have a data on the public domain on FTA utilization, and we don't have a data on services. And in fact, if we don't have a data on investment, the biggest data flaw that we have actually today is an investment data of by country, by sector. I mean, if you go to the DPIIT website, you will not get it. So therefore, unless there is data, it is very difficult for academics to give a feedback. Now coming to the industry feedback, because we have many industry stalwarts here, when a trade negotiation begins and we do our consultations, we find that most of the time the industry says, keep my sector closed and open everything else, okay? So this does not happen. Like while Sir talked about 40% rules of origin, every industry in India wanted UAE 40% rules of origin. Our biggest export item and import item is gems and jewelry. You are importing from the UAE, you are processing or selling. Is labor of 40% value addition? Is the question that I'm asking, because you will see soon after the agreement there is a surge in imports. But then the industry goes and says, oh no, I want something to cater to the domestic market, because they are not able to utilize the FTA because they put in such rigid conditions on the FTA. Mine is more for the industry to think about that if you put in such rigid conditions on the FTAs, and in a democratic country, ultimately the policymakers go by the majority opinion. So utilization is something that what we ask for rather than, what we, and also what we achieve. So this is something that is a key takeaway from my side. In terms of policy making, the complexity of policy making is in India, we have too many schemes and policies. And once we sat down to actually compile them, it was 300 odd schemes and policies. And many industry people tell us that we go to other countries like Thailand simply because we have to read rest documents on policy. So there is a need for somewhere for policies to be synchronized, like either the foreign trade policy or RODTAP or the Desh Bill. All of them are coming up. Individually, all of them are good. But, it is too many to consume. There are certain very good things happening in India. I think the logistic policy and the plan, if implemented, would be something in the right direction. But I would give you some very low-hanging fruits as example to take away and think as you discuss in this forum. One is that, like express, we use sample for express delivery, fast-track movement, and we have not allowed perishable in it simply because we are cutting and pasting an old 1998 regulation. Airport infrastructure has evolved, so this is something which is a very low-hanging fruit. From 1998, you have cut and pasted in 2010, and one custom in Bombay suddenly stopped every vaccine and everything to move around. So this is something like these low-hanging fruits have to be picked up and really addressed in terms of policy. Secondly is that when we are looking into a trade negotiating partner like European Union, it is very good to negotiate an FTA. But we were talking about FTAs, I was there, Amit was there, we were in 2008-9, and EU at that time gave us a text which Vietnam signed on. Today, EU is handing over a text which is Australia-New Zealand agreement with new chapters on trade and sustainable development, digital. So, more you do a delay in trade agreement, things are not going to be better for you. On the other hand, unilaterally you have increased tariffs. So things are not going to be easy. So it is better to be fast track. Last and again in fast track, please see where you have a sensitivity. If there is a farmer involved in the supply chain and there is a real big worry for your farmer, maybe in a product like dairy, think about, can I actually allow GI products? Something which is not a common type of a cheese or a common type of a skim milk, or can I allow intermediate product? The same holds for wines and spirits. Like if you go back and say we cannot give automobile, we cannot give wines and spirit, we cannot give dairy, I don't think you can do a trade agreement with either the EU or close a bigger deal with, you have done a deal with Australia, but you haven't really, Australia has not been able to take it to the parliament. And I leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you, Arpita. I know we have Ms. Amit Yadav here. I'm sure he will respond to some of that. But before that, may I turn to you, Dr. Singh, if you could bring in your experience and Meda, his organization is Ikdvaj. So, I mean, if I would turn to you, Dr. Singh, to kind of bring the global perspective in terms of how do we get there and when, how do you do it?
Thank you. Thank you very much. The previous speakers have raised a number of points, very relevant points, including low-hanging fruits. And I'm sure when we look at different initiatives, there will be several low-hanging fruits. So the first thing would be and the government has done that to some extent, but to have a comprehensive exercise on that. Since in the introduction of reaching 10% of global exports, the starting point was 1.8%. My presumption is it's a merchandise exports, which is the base. So I will use that as a starting point. It doesn't mean that whatever I'm going to say does not apply to services. So today, there is only one country which has at least 10% of global exports, and that's China. It has 15%. US used to have it earlier, but now has about 7.5. So if there is anything to learn about reaching this target, perhaps China is the best example. And we are lucky in the sense that China has been a model for several other countries which have tried to focus on export growth. And China itself learned from Japan and Korea, etc. So let's see, when was China in a situation in terms of export share similar to India? It was 1990. Its share was about 1.8%. And in 2010, 20 years later, it reached 10%. So China reached the target we are trying to reach in 20 years. We have about 26, 27 years to go. So surely we can also manage this target, provided we go about implementing policies with the approach of China, and to the extent we need to deviate from it, learn from what needs to be deviated from and why. So the task today is more difficult than what China experienced in its own time, because it actually had very much fewer competitors. Today, India has many more competitors. And the interesting thing is, Chinese export share grew faster than every competitor during these 20 years, except for Vietnam in the last 10 years. So we can learn something from Vietnam also, but it's lucky that Vietnam actually broadly follows the same approach as China. So what is China's approach? The general approach, so I'll first talk about China's approach, in which context I'll mention the policies, and then I'll comment on the Indian key aspects which we need to keep in mind. The first thing China did was to recognize that trade policy is actually an industrial policy. Inside the border, outside the border, etc. It gave specific emphasis to export markets with several initiatives and policy measures to focus on exports. Here is China, a large economy. It gave focus to export global markets. It gave emphasis to global value chains, which you have talked about already, and to FDI. I had gone to one of the major economic zones of China, and very proudly the person who was looking after it said, we have got 200 of the global 500 firms here investing. So they were looking for key firms. So specific links and discussions for steps ahead with the so-called lead firms. Lead firms in a GVC manage the GVC. They could be Indian, they could be foreign, and in some industries, they're a combination. And in that context, also consultation with industries on key pain points to be addressed. And that's where the low-hanging fruits can come out. So meaningful discussions, and they become relevant in another context. China strategically focused And Ambassador Suri talked about strategic steps, etc. On priority sectors, which doesn't mean it didn't focus on policies which help every sector, but they took specific steps for priority sectors. They emphasize scale of operation, which is very important. For a third thing, they emphasize ecosystem development. Without scale of operation, you cannot have ecosystem development. So you need specific policies for that. Scale of operations means you need inputs from any source you can get to operate at a large level. So that was another thing they emphasized. In the background to that was that they recognized that exports actually need imports. So China's share in global imports today is 12%, which is the second highest in the world. And if you see the rise of their imports share, it mirrors the rise of their export share. And they facilitated imports. They of course, had greater ability to control various economic operations, but they facilitated them in order to enable both exports and scale. They focused on competitiveness in GVCs. GVCs, people compete in three different ways. One is cost effectiveness. One is a timely turnaround of processing of imports and then exporting. And third is a consistent quality of inputs. They focused on that, and they started from a place where they were actually miserably inept in this. They focused on coordination of activities among implementing agents, something which India has begun to do. They monitored to ensure that implementation was effectively done. In fact, in the Indian context, what we have seen in studies in the last 3-4 years, good policies are announced, but there is a gap between policy and implementation on the ground. And that's where discussions with industry become very important. Now, what about the Indian approach? Till now, actually, exports have been treated more as a residual activity rather than treating the global market as a focus. That is changing. In fact, last year, the Prime Minister's speech on 6th August, one of the big objectives he emphasized along with participation in global value chains was a manifold increase in exports. But for that, we need to change that approach of focusing on the domestic market primarily. And how do you do that? You need policies for that. And how do you ensure that those who are feeling insecure get a transition time? So policy measures are there, and China had applied that to some extent. So competition does not mean competing better in the domestic market. It means competing better in the global markets. Recently, there was a newspaper report, and more than one person has said that by 2030, India will be the third largest economy. And Arvind Panagaria, when he said that, he said we need to open up and increase our scale of operations. So the scale aspect is very, very significant. And how do we achieve that? Countries which have outcompeted India actually have done so through scale. I'll give you some examples. In electronics exports, 2 minutes.
Okay.
So 2001, exports of Vietnam were less than India. In 2021, they were 9 times. Clothing exports, Bangladesh and Vietnam were less than India in 2000. They were double the exports of India in 2020. So why does this happen? Because of the policy and other disabilities or as competitive disadvantage which the companies are facing. The PLI scheme, the origin is actually an attempt to address those disabilities. And they are addressed both through facilitation policy, Gati Shakti will address it, etc. So identify the disabilities, quantify them because they were quantified, and then PLI schemes came up. and systematically work at it. The government is engaged with it. I wish them and the industry luck in that. There is also, in terms of scale, the scale required for our competitors to export is much smaller than that required for India. And why is that? Because India's population is much larger, and the growth in demand is going to be much larger than the competing countries. I just took Korea, Mexico, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam. So if you take a look at GDP, the ratios range from 11.5 to 57% of India's GDP. The population ranges from 4% to 20%. So compared to GDP, their population is way smaller than India's population, but their exports range from 58% to 163% of India, namely even larger than India. So they are able to find that scale when domestic demand is met more easily than India. As a result, trade deficit of India is the highest. In fact, if you take the top 20 importers in the world, other than US, India is the highest. It is about 45% of exports. Namely, how much more exports do you need to cover up the trade deficit? FTAs, India has 4, and we are going to have more, and hopefully good ones, which is the objective. The others have 7 to 16. Vietnam has 16 FTAs with the top 20 importers in the world. And when you are in GVC, just talking about GVC without policy on the ground is not adequate. These countries are linked to GVCs. Do you know how many proportion of lines, tariff lines for non-agriculture products have zero duty? Because zero duty enables you to move very easily. India has 1.8%, say 2%. They range from 19% to 65%. And most of them are 40 to 65%. So they prepare through various policies, while we have looked at tariffs as a mechanism for improving our own capabilities. But when you use that, you are actually raising costs and reducing competitiveness. So how do you manage this dilemma? And because of the population, the growth in income, with tariffs which actually make you look inwards rather than outwards, India will never be a net foreign exchange earner until unless we try and develop a system which addresses this disability, which India faces in a policy sense. So we are going the direction of China in many, many areas. We are doing well. The path ahead is good, but at the same time, there are policy aspects which make us look inwards rather than outwards. So those are the issues which we have to deal with in an industrial policy context. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. Mr. Yadav, I think there have been enough points which have come up from various speakers, and from a government perspective and a policy perspective, how do you put this?
Thanks. I think so. A lot of policy prescriptions have been provided by Dr. Singh, and he's set this tone. And this is obviously open-ended discussion, and we are talking of various aspects. But just to bring clarity on one of the points raised before I move in, Australia has a treaty-making process which involves going to the parliament. And when the treaty was signed, thereafter the government changed, elections were held, government has changed. But that's not the point. The point is the treaty-making process goes through the parliament process, and that is fixed by the parliament. So that will take some time before the treaty happens. And we have a bipartisan support, and the Australian side has communicated in as many words that there are no challenges on it getting it approved. The challenge is the parliament takes its own time. You can't shorten that period. And that's the same with the UK. We'll face the same situation when we'll sign the agreement with the UK, that it has to go through the treaty-making process, and which goes through the parliament. I think so. The policy there's no one recipe for how do you take and leapfrog from where you are to 10%. There are a number of actions to be taken, number of interventions to be taken, and we are on the right path as has been pointed out. We are looking at government as a whole and working, as Ambassador Suri also said, working in tandem with our various ministries and especially with the Ministry of External Affairs and the High Commissions and our embassies on this aspect. So looking at it, let's start the beginning. The beginning is when you want to set up a business, and as Dr. Singh has said, industrialization, and because he's largely talking of manufacturing, but I'll go both for manufacturing and services. You need something to start a business, and for there, you need financing, you need entrepreneurship, you need some product which is there. How do those facilitative measures are in place, and are there challenges? There is one aspect of it. If we are able to bring in capital, have proper trade finance, and we are able to set up a business with making it both on the price and quality, then obviously you have a market to serve. Now within the market, you have a domestic market and you have a foreign market. On the export side, obviously because of the large population, we have focused more on the traditional products which have been the strength of our exports. And I think so that's one aspect which all of us need to look at it. Almost the whole world, which it trades on 70% of the product where we don't have a presence. We have a presence on the 30% of which on the world exports. And on that 30%, the focus is on the items, whether it's leather, gems and jewelry, garments, textiles, and so on and so forth. So the world exports, if you analyze it, they are going on technology products, innovation products, and those are also high value. So that is the focus which we have to move. The manufacturing base has to move from high technology products, have to move to products with innovation, products which, whether it's in the area of telecommunication, whether it's in the area of high cost IT products, whether I'm talking of products, I'm not talking of services right now, or whether it's in the generics and so on and so forth, to specialized products across engineering sectors, where we are now getting a huge strength, almost 100 billion we would be touching only on the engineering and engineering related manufacturing. Similarly, on the services side, we are going, I think so, on certain sectors much fast, but as a policy, we need to look into various other sectors. Fintech is one which has a huge potential other than the IT, and a lot of IT. Actually, the finance and the banking sector is the biggest user and the innovator for a lot of financial product on the IT side. So IT feeds into the financial services. So that's another area where we have to work on. As a policy, we are addressing that. FTAs have been talked about. Within the FTAs, I think so, some are already been negotiated, some are already entered into force, and some are work in progress. That's one part of the whole thing, that gives you an access to a market, it gives you an access to an economy. And when you're talking of an economy which is UK is almost of similar size, now we've just beaten them in the size of economy, but they're of similar size. So you get an access which is not of the population, which is also of the size of economy. European Union, it's not the population, it's the size of the economy which matters. And almost 25% of our trade happens with European Union. And as has been pointed out, it's a give and take. But the important process is that you have to involve the stakeholders. And I think so in the FTAs, we have been doing that. So I think so India of what we are or what we were, and as Dr. Singh has pointed out, a lot of things have changed. this India, which was at the multilateral fora, which he would experienced himself, we were the one who would be the blockers. Now people acknowledge that we are the deal makers. We sit with them and we do that, and we do finally engage with them, and we come out with solutions which provide global answers or global solutions in the multilateral. So the focus has changed, the outlook has changed. The department is building capacities, the department is reorganizing it, and all of this is part of this whole understanding that if we have to increase the exports, there is a lot to do within the department, working with the industries. Every FTA has huge consultation. It is down to a single unit which may be impacted in certain sectors where it's happening, and we can't get anything passed unless we have a confirmation that all sectors we have had the interaction with the industry. So we are also engaging with think tanks in a bigger way than probably we were doing earlier. So that's also part of it. And unless we have one thing which was also talked about, how do we make businesses aware? We're communicating to businesses, and I think so UAE and Australia, after we engaged, we had an outreach program covering multiple cities just to communicate on what is the content of the agreements, so that the stakeholder and interested trade partners are part of it. The solution is not one, whether one is obviously the manufacturing. We have therefore looked at how do we, in the role of the flexibility which can be possible in the SEZs, come out with a draft Desh bill, which would probably expand the manufacturing base, which will give much more flexibility than what is available, and we're working on that part of it. Services has been a tremendous growth, and combined right now we have, last year the trade was roughly around 700 billion, and what you're talking of is 10%. The whole global trade right now is in the order of 28 trillion, and we are around 770 last year. And if we have to become 10%, that means we are talking of a 2.8 trillion kind of thing. So we have to fourfold increase that. We are expecting a growth from that high jump which happened last year, again in this year, which needs to be sustained. And as has been announced, not formally, but otherwise that is what internally we are working on, that we look at a 2 trillion in the coming next 7 years, which would be both in the goods and services. So that is the path which we have chosen. We have worked for within the government, with stakeholders, changing policy, improving the functioning of the department, strengthening the department. We are now, the ministries are coming to us and saying, please give us trade advisors. We need trade advisors. We are looking at supporting the ministries who have the lot of stakes on the trade advising on the trade. Similarly, we are holding sessions on ministry capacities. We've done it with the secretaries. We've done it with their cutting level joint secretaries and directors, and so that all of that is part of this whole exercise, which is a continuum. There are so many suggestions which have come today, and so many suggestions which we receive from time to time. All of this feeds into only one objective, and what at the opening was said with regard to exports being X percentage of the global, of the total GDP. I think so that recognition is very clear. Exports are not, as was said, exports are not residual. Probably that was the mindset at the earlier time. Exports are, the economy is integrated. If you count both imports and export, we are in the order of roughly of 40%. And if we include the diaspora, which sends its remittances, which is in the order of around 75 to 80 billion, then we are talking of 45% of the economy, of the GDP contribution is coming from export, imports, and the whole trade part of it, and the remittances. All of this, I think so, gives us the confidence that that percentage which is there is on the rise. We are on track for what we are trying to achieve, and lot of policy suggestions. I think so. Everyone, we welcome that, and I think so. The whole government, whether it's on PLI, whether it's on, I've not talked about it, whether it's on Gati Shakti, whether it's on the logistic part of it, or whether coming out with the Champion Services Sector scheme, and so on and so forth. We've worked towards that, and the engagement at the WTO also shows that confidence on engaging and taking on the world. The supply chain, I think so, one word on that before I conclude. The global value chain, we are a small partner on that, and that should be recognized. Of the total global value chain, we are just less than 2% of the global value chain, while the total world trade is in the order of 70% of the total trade which happens on the global value chain. 70% is on global value chain, and the rest is other than global value chain. Our contribution to the exports in that sense is minuscule 2%. And that is, I think so, the part which was, whether it's tariff, whether it's trade facilitation, whether it's logistic, all of that are decisions which will ensure that the settlement or setting up of manufacturing or being part of that whole global value chain. And I think so it's recognized. And therefore we are looking at the value, making a distinction between value chain and a global value chain. Being part of the value chain, a global chain, supply chain is one part, but being part of the global value chain is a separate thing. So we are part of the global supply chain, but being part of the global value chain is something which we have to strive for. And I think so that is the key work which we are doing, that how do we ensure that. Thank you. I think so I've exceeded my time. But
thank you, Mr. Yadav. Unfortunately, the minister is already getting here. So I'll have to conclude this session, and thank you all panelists for the time. Ravi, over to you to conclude the session.
We can go on, such an excellent panel, excellent discussion. Just wanted to leave you with a thought. A British economist actually traced the history, 2000 years of Indian history, and he found out that from 1 CE all the way up to 1700 CE, India held about 1/4 of the world's GDP. So now we are again aspiring to be 10%, and I think we all heard that we are on the right path. And I guess my key takeaway for this session was right partnerships, right dialogue, right negotiations, right learning, and right policy. So, and last but not the least, the right communication. So thank you very much for this excellent interaction, Ambassador Suri and Dr. Arpita, Dr. Harshvardhan, and Anil ji. Thank you so much.